Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So we're going to be talking about from good to great. And we're going to be talking really about the difference between the greatness that lies within us, which is true for every single one of us, and the greatness that lies to us, which is probably true for every single one of us as well. The greatness that lies to us, which is a lie, and the greatness that lies within us. And hopefully by the end of this morning, we'll have clarity on that. Every single person pursues greatness. Some people pursue greatness in fantasy. They watch, the Olympics are going on, so we watch these people perform outstandingly in the greatest way, and we fantasize about us doing that, although realistically we don't think we would ever do something like that. And then there is greatness that some pursue in reality. We truly want to be great people. And that's an ambition that every single person should pursue. And this is a great ideal that's advocated greatly in our country, in America. I want to show you a video that sort of expresses this. And this idea which we're going to watch is actually a very Jewish idea that goes all the way back to the Talmud. So what did we see? To get what we never had, we must do what we've never done. We must be ready to go the 101st miler. In the language of the Talmud, we cannot compare someone who studies something 100 times to someone who studies something 101 times. Because it's when a person is ready to take themselves that one step beyond their natural ability that we suddenly find someone performing in a great way. That's why mediocrity is one of the greatest sins that someone can do. And that is probably the greatest disease of mankind is mediocrity. But actually, what I want to talk to you about is not this type of greatness, because we're all familiar with this type of greatness. And that is to get things and to do things. To get what we've never had, to do as we've never done before. But what we really want to discuss is true greatness. And true greatness is not about what we do. Because when we discuss how we're performing, what we're actually talking about is an expression of our own selves, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but this is a society that we live in which constantly tells people to try and outperform the other person so that I am greater, so that I am making more. And the Torah actually teaches us that this is not truly greatness. What this is great performance, but it's not a great person. Someone who makes it to the top of their law firm, someone who is the most prominent doctor in the world, or for that matter, the most prominent rabbi in the world, is not necessarily a great person. Because great performance and greatness are two very different things. And this is the point I would like to bring out this morning. how to discover what true greatness is, how to aspire to it, how to make it a part of who we are. We all have the external part of our lives and we have the internal part of our lives. And external part of our lives are the performances, are the things that we do, the expressions of ourselves. But then there is who we are. And when we look in someone's eyes, we no longer see what they've achieved. What we see is who the person is. And that's the reason why we get quite disappointed sometimes when we meet someone who we think to be a great person, and when we hang around them enough for them to be comfortable to be themselves, we suddenly discover a person that's very unsatisfying. And that's not what we want to aspire to be. This is actually expressed in a very interesting Jewish law. A Jewish anecdote, perhaps, that the Talmud tells us about kosher fish. The Talmud tells us that in order for a fish to be kosher, the Torah says, it needs to have fins and scales. The Talmud tells us something fascinating. If you find a fish that has fins but doesn't have scales, is it kosher? No. If you find a fish that has scales but doesn't have fins, is it kosher? Yes. The Talmud says yes. Why does the Talmud say yes? The reason why the Talmud says yes is because the Talmud states a fact. That if you ever find a fish that has scales, you know that it has fins. And if you don't see the fins, it means someone cut them off. That's why it's kosher. Now, Moses wasn't a deep sea swimmer, right? So obviously he knew this because God told us to him orally at Mount Sinai. But there is a lesson that the Rebbe teaches from this point, and that is that you see, scales are a reflection of a part of ourselves that protects ourselves so that we are moral, upstanding, decent, good people. Fins are an expression of our ambitions to accomplish, to do, to conquer. When someone has fins, they are ambitious. They are not necessarily moral, upstanding people. Unfortunately, this is rampant around us. But if someone has scales, that means that they protect their inner core to be fine and proper, then you know that this person, this fish, definitely has fins. They will definitely be a healthy, ambitious person. And this is the exact point, that someone may be very great in their achievement. That doesn't mean that they are great in person. But if someone is great in person, you know that they will have a great impact in the world. So that's what we want to understand what this greatness is. And in order to understand this greatness, we have to do what we always need to do. And this is something that Hasidic philosophy really tries to help us with as much as we are willing to be helped. And that is that we simply have to take off our glasses and we have to put on a new pair of glasses with a new set of lens so that we begin to see the world as we know it differently. So we begin to see a completely different world. We have to look at the world differently. And when we do, what we find, which is fascinating, is we begin to see so many ironies in the world. There are so many things that we see as one color, and it's actually the completely opposite color. It's quite shocking. And this is actually one of those examples. And here's my challenge to you. And my challenge to you, not as a challenge from me to you, but as a challenge from you to yourself. Because only if we challenge ourselves will we walk out with something, somewhat of an experience and a transformation here. And that is that while the concept that I'm going to discuss with you, you may agree with intellectually, you have to ask yourself if there's any part of your life and behavior that contradicts the concept. And then we can begin to see that while in theory we may believe this idea, how much of it has penetrated us, and that's what we need to do, get it to penetrate us. So let's talk about greatness is humility. There's a statement in the Talmud which basically sums up our entire discussion. It's a fascinating and a very deep statement. And this is the statement. B'makom gedulaso sham ata motzean vasanuso. Any place where you find evidence of the greatness of God, you also find evidence of His humility. If you want to know where God's greatness is expressed, you will always find it in a place where God is being humble. I want to explain this concept, And then we're going to see how this concept is true for every single one of us ourselves as we are created in the image of God. God humbles himself to reveal himself to us. So, in order for God, the infinite being, to be able to interact with us, what does God need to do? He needs to portray himself in a finite manner, in a limited manner, in a manner that reaches our level. Look at it as, imagine if Einstein were standing here lecturing to us, right? We would have no idea what he's talking about, unless he has the ability to narrow down the ideas to a level that we can comprehend. That means he's going to humble himself in order to come to our level. This is what God does for existence to exist. I'll give you an example. I took a trip about 18 years ago from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And we decided on the way to stop in, I think it was Yosemite National Park, right? And we were just there for about 2 hours. But I'll never forget the image I saw when we were there. We drove up to a big mountain, and we looked down into a valley that must have been 1,000 feet below us. And it was the most magnificent landscape that I ever saw. It was absolutely beautiful, absolutely a work of God. And when I saw it, it was so awesome, and that's truly the word to define what it was, that I was in awe. What was I in awe of? I was in awe of our Creator, of God, right? Now, are we going to say that that landscape sums up the reality of God? God is far, far greater than that. God is an infinite being. But in order for God to come to our level for us to appreciate or be in awe of God, God actually humbles himself to put himself in an environment which is far, far lower than who God truly is. And that is where we see God's greatness. We see greatness when there is a great act of humility. I'm going to show you how this is true as human beings. We all know this, actually, almost instinctively, that this is true. There was a gentleman that was once speaking to the Rebbe about working on a certain project, which the Rebbe was encouraging him to do, and he was concerned about how he's going to make a livelihood. And the Rebbe, in trying to encourage him and give him some faith, told him, you know that God feeds every single bird in the world. Right? We say a verse in the morning prayers, Poseach es yodecha, God opens his hand, umasbia, and he satisfies, he sustains, l'chol chai, to all living things, ratzon, their will. He gives every living thing what they need. He says, do you think if God can supply it for every single bird, he can supply it for you? Now, granted, that takes an act of faith, but it's also an act of humility to realize, pay attention to the fact that every single bird out there goes out there to the squirrels that run around in my yard every day. They don't know where their breakfast is going to come from. We have a bank account, right? We save up some money, and then we have security and insurances and all of those things. The squirrel doesn't know, but the squirrel's there the next day and the following day and the following day because God supplies the squirrel. That's greatness, but that's such a humble act for God. The Talmud is telling us, where do you find God's greatness? You find it in God's greatest acts of humility. In fact, the greater the act of humility, the greater you see the greatness of God. So greatness of people as well is always expressed in humble ways. That's why you always find, whenever people speak about great people, they use an example of something great that they did. You know what they did? When there was a little child crying on the floor, this great man stopped and picked up the child and held the child until the parents were found. That's how we describe great people, in the most humble acts. Because the greater a person is and the more humble the act is, the greater the disparity between the two, the greater the greatness that we see. Let me tell you a story about a Jew by the name of Moshe Chaim Danzig. You ever hear of him? He's a Jew that lives in New Jersey. Moshe Chaim Danzig is the guy who's in the synagogue. He's always the person that cleans up the dirty tissues that people leave behind. He puts back the prayer books that other people don't put back. He's the person where if you have a trouble and you have no one to talk to, his shoulder. You cry in his shoulder. Special guy. And to him, to everyone in the community, this man was a great man. What made Moshe Chaim such a great Jew? So a friend of his once told him, you must have been brought up by the most elevated, most wonderful parents in the most wonderful home, to have developed to be such a sensitive human being. And so Moshe Chaim told him, you know something? If you were to have seen the home I was brought up in, you would describe it as the classic dysfunctional home. That's actually where I was brought up. So his friend said, so how did you develop to be such a fine person? And this is what he said. He said, when I was in 6th grade, I had a rabbi that taught our class. And this teacher was a survivor of the Holocaust. He had numbers on his arm. He was old school. His English sounded like Yiddish. But he was the finest person. If there was a child that forgot his lunch, he would provide the child with his the rabbi would give the child the rabbi's own lunch. And that was the way he was. He saw a child was disturbed. He would come over to him and ask him what's going on. He was always there to comfort every kid. And one day, he says, I remember that my teacher, this rabbi, comes into class on a wintry, cold day, shaking from the cold. And I asked him, where's your coat? So he said, on my way here, I went through the Avenue J subway station, if you're familiar with Brooklyn. And there was a homeless man laying there, and he had nothing covering him. And when I saw that, I just took off my coat, I just spread it over him while he was sleeping so he should have some warmth. So this student, this Moshe Chaim, was in a state of shock. He's like, you took your own coat and put it on this homeless guy? You don't even know who he is? But there was something deeper that was disturbing this boy Moshe Chaim. And that was, he said, you told us that you survived Auschwitz. You saw your own family killed before your own eyes. You saw the greatest atrocities in the world. How is it that you act with such kindness when you saw such horrible atrocities around you? How are you so sensitive? And he said this. He said, when I saw all of the pain and suffering that was going on around me, all of the senselessness that was being done by human beings, I decided that this is going to be my Rebbe, my teacher, this pain and suffering. And I decided at that time that just as someone is attempting to destroy the world with pain and suffering, I am going to build the world with acts of kindness. And I decided then in Auschwitz that this is going to guide me the rest of my life. And whenever I see any human being that needs some help, I am going to help them. And so Moshe Chaim told his friend, I decided to make my teacher's teacher my teacher. And therefore, I am devoted to helping other people. Acts of complete humility that have nothing to do with him. And these acts of complete humility are the greatest indications of greatness. And again, the more humble the deed, the greater we see greatness in the person. And the larger the contrast that there is, the gap between how great the person is and how humble the act is an indication of the level of greatness that there is. I once heard someone, how there's a great movement of false humility. You may know what I'm talking about. It's like when someone asks you to do something and you say, me, no, not me, not me. And they ask you again, no, no, no. And after the third time and the whole room heard that you were asked, then you finally say, okay, I'll do it. So I once heard someone respond to someone who was acting with false humility, and he told him this. He said, don't be so humble, you're not so great. But actually this idea brings out this very point. The less great a person is, the less humble they need to be. The less humble a person is, the less great they are. Because the two of them go hand in hand. Greatness is defined by humility. What's the irony of this? The irony of this is that the Torah is teaching us that be less about yourself, and that's how you'll be great. And one asks, the less I am about myself, the less I am. How can that make me great? And this is the great irony of this truth. That in fact, the less we are of and about ourselves, in fact, the greater people know we are to be.